Gen Z's average job stint is 1.1 years, the shortest on record, shorter than millennials at 1.8, shorter than Gen X at 2.8. The people watching this number treat it as a character flaw. What they're not asking is what the number is actually responding to. Entry-level job postings fell 29 percentage points since January 2024, based on Randstad's review of 126 million global postings. 58% of recent Gen Z graduates were still looking for full-time work, compared with 25% of earlier generations. LinkedIn's workforce report found that 35% of entry-level jobs required 3 or more years of experience. A generation being accused of not committing, entering a market that was already pulling up the ladder behind it. Have you ever applied to an entry-level role that required 3 years of experience and wondered who these jobs are actually for? That's not you misreading the market. That's the market revealing itself. This is what your generation stepped into. Not a market where loyalty gets rewarded, a market that shrank the entry points, raised the requirements, and then expressed surprise when the people who made it through weren't inclined to stay. Randstad's research team did something most employers haven't bothered to do. They actually asked Gen Z workers why they leave. What they found was unambiguous. Gen Z is not job hopping for the sake of it. They're moving because of ambition and a perceived lack of pathways within the roles they are exiting. Not boredom, not disloyalty. The specific, concrete experience of reaching the ceiling of what a role offers and finding that the organization has no next step ready. The career ladder we expected Gen Z to climb is missing a few rungs. And when the rungs aren't there, moving to a different ladder isn't quitting. It's the only logical move. But then there's something else happening here. Because the job hopping story has a second layer that almost nobody talks about honestly, and it has to do with what staying actually used to mean. For the generations who built careers at a single company, tenure produced something concrete: pension accumulation, salary seniority, internal advancement that came with time. The staying was rational because the staying paid, in security, in progression, in a reasonable expectation that the years you invested would compound in your favor. Think about the last time you actually modeled what staying at your current job would deliver over the next 3 years. The raise cycle, the promotion timeline, the realistic ceiling, and then compare that to what moving would deliver: a market rate salary reset, a title adjustment, skills acquired by necessity. For most Gen Z workers in most organizations, the math on staying doesn't close the way it once did. Atlanta Fed data shows the median pay bump for job switchers shrank to 4.8%, down from a peak of 7.7% in early 2023. The premium for leaving has nearly disappeared. So why is Gen Z still leaving? Because the financial calculation was never the whole story. It was a signal, temporarily visible, that the organizations offering jobs weren't offering the thing that made staying worth it. And that thing hasn't changed just because the salary premium did. Now here's where it gets interesting. Financial insecurity among Gen Z jumped from 30% in 2024 to 48% in 2025, according to Deloitte's survey of 23,000 plus respondents across 44 countries, an 18 percentage point increase in a single year. More than half live paycheck to paycheck. This is the financial baseline of a generation being described as unwilling to commit. And here's what that context produces. When financial security isn't coming from tenure anyway, when loyalty doesn't accumulate into a pension, when seniority doesn't translate into stability, the calculation that kept previous generations in place simply doesn't apply. Previous generations stayed because staying built something. Gen Z moves because staying has stopped building anything. The behavior changed because the return changed. That's not a generational character flaw. That's an economic update. But let's clear something up. The conversation about Gen Z and job hopping is almost entirely conducted by the people who benefit most from them staying. Employers who prefer retention to competitive compensation. HR departments measured on turnover rates. Business press that frames worker mobility as a management problem to be solved. What that conversation consistently avoids is the question of what organizations on the other side are actually offering. Deloitte's 2025 survey found that 61% of Gen Z report good mental well-being when satisfied with recognition, versus only 41% when dissatisfied. A 20-point gap, tied to a single controllable variable. The retention problem is solvable, but most organizations haven't started asking why their jobs don't qualify. They're still running the same review cycles, the same opaque promotion timelines, the same vague feedback that lands as, keep doing what you're doing. What a Gen Z employee actually needs to hear is simpler. Where is this going? How long will it take? And is the answer real? Not a ping pong table, not a wellness stipend. A credible answer to a reasonable question. You don't fix a job-hopping generation by lecturing them about commitment. You fix it by creating jobs worth committing to. Here's what they don't tell you. The generation that changes jobs every year didn't arrive at that behavior by accident. They arrived at it by watching. Watching what happened to people who stayed through restructurings. Watching loyalty get rewarded with a severance package and a LinkedIn recommendation. Watching the implicit contract between employer and employee get renegotiated without anyone asking the employees. And then they made a different calculation. Yeah, not because they don't value commitment. Deloitte's research found 89% of Gen Z consider a sense of purpose essential to their job satisfaction. Not because they don't want stability, because they haven't yet found an employer who offered the conditions that would make staying feel rational. And so they keep looking. Every 1.1 years, they keep looking. That's not disloyalty. That's the most optimistic thing about your generation. You haven't stopped believing that a job worth staying in exists. You're just unwilling to pretend you found one before you have. So the next time someone calls your generation disloyal for leaving roles that offered no path, at organizations that offered no runway, in a market that offered 29% fewer entry points than 2 years ago, remember what the number is actually measuring. Not a failure of commitment, a refusal to accept what's being offered as more than it's worth. The generation that keeps moving isn't broken. It got the job, looked around, and realized the destination they'd been promised was someone else's starting point. Now tell me, are you team, I left because there was nowhere to go, or team, I'm still in a role I've outgrown because I don't know what the next move is? Drop it in the comments. And if this video finally gave language to a decision you've been defending for years, hit subscribe. We're here every week breaking down the psychology of work that nobody talks about. Because understanding why you are the way you are, that's not just interesting, that's powerful.